thank you everyone as people are starting to roll into the room here for coming to our webinar. It's our first webinar of 2022, which is exciting. So we're here with Jeff Ogren and Brad Kosman. They're going to go over a case study around discovering a high value audience in the travel industry. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. We'll be moderating throughout. And then you can always reach us info@softcrylic.com moving forward. If you have any other questions about our services, how we can help you, or any questions on the presentation today. With that, I'll hand it over to you guys.
All right, thanks, Sammy. Thanks for joining us today. We have a really cool kind of client use case we wanted to present today. And really, probably around post-COVID, coming out of COVID, we had a client come to us asking for, assistance on what was happening to their kind of shopping behaviors on their website. As well, they were looking for patterns between, different subsections and subsegments of what were happening on the website. And of course, I looped in Brad to this conversation to see what data we have available for this client. And we decided to come up with an approach that we do for other clients as well, which is, finding high value audiences. This one's really focused on the travel industry as well. So before I hand it over to Brad as well, just wanted to state that, this data is obfuscated what we're going through, and it's all sample data as we go through this. But Brad, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so Jeff already gave most of the background here, but we want to just show what our process is. We call it audience modeling. We've used it, as you mentioned, across a bunch of different clients. We thought this was a really good illustrative use case of it. We were able to identify a couple of really high value audiences, or at least audiences that are actionable, easy to target, and easy to come up with strategies to message against. So yeah, I guess what we're going to be discussing today is a little bit of that use case in particular, but mostly we're going to be viewing it through the lens of the process that we've come up with. And we've developed this process kind of organically throughout the last few years, starting with the first projects along the lines of audience identification. We just kind of keep honing it at every chance we get to deploy it.
Awesome. Let's dive into it.
Yeah, so overall, the goal of our process, and of course the goal for this project, is to identify high value customer segments, be able to target them in multiple channels online, and then being able to measure how effective that is, right? Because your strategy, measuring the output of it is obviously extremely important. And so what we've done here is crafted this process and crafted our approach in such a way that you can measure everything at an individual level. So you know whether or not you targeted somebody with messaging, you know what kind of persona labels you've given them, and you know whether or not they converted, right? So we have tried to make this process as transparent as possible, where analysts, strategists not only get to define the personas themselves, but they also get to see very clearly what kind of effect their strategies and their messaging are having on specific audiences. We do employ machine learning throughout this process. ML can be kind of considered a black box at times, and we want to avoid that. We want people to feel comfortable with the outputs of the process here. So just going to get into a lot more detail here, but obviously the first step in the process is data, right? So you need to be able to collect data at the customer level across digital, on-site media, even offline in some cases, sometimes third-party data. That all needs to be stitched together at the customer level, and it needs to be clean. And basically, once that data is in place, you can move into an exploratory analysis. This is just playing with the data and seeing if any patterns show themselves. Then we have a modeling phase, which we'll get into, and persona analysis. And persona analysis is really where you get into the strategic aspects of things and taking the data and using that data to define specific audience segments for targeting. So there are a few different prerequisites for this data set. Again, it needs to be stitched together at the customer level. You want that holistic customer profile for every individual that you're going to be studying. And the data needs to be clean for some value of the word clean. And Jeff, pass it back to you.
Yep. Yeah, so what I'm going to go over is really the setup, how we started this. And really, I wanted to put a focus point on Tapestry. So Brad was alluding to earlier, we have this platform internally at Softcrylic that we deploy on clients, websites as well as media, right? And what Tapestry does is it allows us to collect kind of the media data as well as when someone lands on the website and then whether they convert, for instance. And it really ties in the whole end-to-end picture of everything. And for this, in every project we do, we have the philosophy of GIGO, which is garbage in, garbage out, right? So the data quality is huge when talking about this audience modeling project we work on. Why it's huge is because if you have unclean data, right, feeding the ML model is going to be incorrect completely. So we really focus on, offsite channel taxonomy, on-site content, identifying that, what's part of the user profile, what's part of the product taxonomy, and what is part of the bookings, right? So we're really set up success for this audience modeling analysis because we had all these keys in place. So if you look at the right-hand screen, the kind of Tapestry flow, the yellow is kind of what we already had in place, and the green is what we had to bring into Tapestry. And we didn't actually use it for the analysis, which Brad will talk about more. We used it more for kind of the testing the model, right? So for instance, we bring all the media data into Tapestry. We bring in the on-site user journey, what they did on the website, did they bounce, did they leave? And then when a user gets to the website, we could start building a customer profile if they authenticate, right? We could start collecting those authentication keys. Finally, once you have that, you can start building a lifecycle profile. How often are they coming back? Are they going into the app versus are they just a website user, so forth? And then essentially when they book or convert, right, you can start building that profile for them. And then of course you could overlay third-party demographic data on all of that. So really we had all the kind of setup in place to kind of move right into this for the client. And that's what we'll get to next.
So that foundation, that data foundation is the most important step, and it's really the hard step. But after that, you move into the sort of data aggregation and machine learning portion of the project. And this is where you start putting together all those data sources that Jeff was mentioning a moment ago. And we run them through our sort of internal process, machine learning process for identifying audiences. Then after that, you move into a strategy phase where once you have your audiences, you can start strategizing different approaches to activate against them and to message against them. So this is the basic output of the machine learning step. So we selected a few different variables that would make sense for this project, right? We're trying to identify unique audiences in the travel industry. So what kind of behaviors are associated with this? Well, we can go down the left-hand column here. AP stands for advanced purchase. This is how close to their trip a specific customer booked. So AP less than 7 is they booked within 7 days of their actual trip. Moving down to the next group of variables, this is duration. This is how long somebody stayed on their trip, right? So duration less than 3 is a very short trip, so less than 3 days, right? Moving down from there, Saturday night stay is well known in the travel industry in general to be indicative of certain behaviors, right? If I'm traveling for work, probably not going to stay on Saturday night unless it's somewhere really fun. If I'm traveling with my family, very likely that I am going to stay somewhere on Saturday night. And then we have one book versus multi-book. This is basically just, did somebody have multiple bookings at the same time, or did they just have one booking, right? So if I'm going to be visiting somewhere and staying in multiple places, right, I might have multiple bookings at the same time. And so that would be probably more indicative of like a family vacation, something like that, right? So along the top row, I want you to notice 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So these columns are each audience segments that came out of the process. So based on these variables, the rows, the machine learning was able to identify sort of 5 distinct behavioral patterns. And you can see that in the heat map we have here. So green is over-indexing and red is under-indexing, with orange, yellow, and kind of light green being in the middle. And you can see that there are very distinct differences, right, between each of these groups and where they tend to over-index and where they tend to under-index. So what's happening here is people have very specific behavioral patterns that kind of lump them in with another group of individuals. You can surmise there that basically those behavioral patterns indicate something about why people are traveling, right? Mm-hmm. So if somebody is booking very close to their trip, they're not staying very long, and they're not staying on Saturday nights ever, you can start to think maybe that's a business traveler, right? That's certainly anybody that's traveled for business before, that sounds kind of familiar, right? Whereas if you're going home for Thanksgiving, you're not going to book that 3 days in advance. That's going to have a much longer purchase window, right? So with that said, we have a couple of questions at this point though, right? Number one, we want to validate that the ML routines are finding patterns that make some kind of sense in the real world, right? So we want to layer in some data for that. We also want a little bit richer data for these groups. Well, we want to understand in a little bit more detail who they are by maybe layering in some other variables. But this is the first step. This is just the output. It's raw, and this is where you start to think about persona identification. We call it, right? I mentioned vacation sounds like a business traveler, for example. Yep. That looks like column 1, right?
Exactly.
All right, cool. We want to layer in a little bit more analysis, like I mentioned. So one thing we should mention about the client is they had run a survey against their customers, against known customers. And the survey asked something along the lines of how often do you travel for business versus how often do you travel for leisure? We did not include this as an input into our model. What we just included the behavioral variables that we saw on the last slide. So what we're using this for is as a validation. So we can go into each of these clusters, each of these personas, and see how many of them responded highly on the business versus leisure travel index. So I kind of alluded to this. Far left column, very short booking windows, very short trip durations, don't tend to stay overnight on Saturdays. So we kind of thought that might be business. If you look at the survey results, those also indicate that there's a high density of business travelers in that group, right? The second column here, we're not really sure what to call this, but they tend to have very short booking windows, which is business-like, but they also tend to just book one thing at a time, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that, for whatever reason, that really contrasts them against the pure business group that we see here. Third column over, we believe these to be family and leisure travelers. You can see very, very long advanced purchase windows, longer trip durations, tend to stay on Saturday nights. This is fairly typical, right? There's two more columns that we're not going to mention much more because they're both kind of boring. One is catch-all. Basically, what happens is if you have behaviors that don't fit in any kind of obvious pattern, a lot of times these ML routines will just sort of bucket them all into this giant cluster that doesn't really have any specific patterns, right? Yeah. So this is just sort of the outliers. And then dormant. These are folks that we just simply don't have much data on. They're probably not traveling recently. That's a lot of people over the last couple of years, right? And or they tend to book offline still. But those first three personas, those are folks that have specific behavioral patterns, specific purchase patterns that would allow you to design specific strategies for messaging them. One other thing to point out here is you see 1, 2, 3 to 4 and greater than 4 travelers. These, again, are not data points that we use on the inputs of the ML, but they can be used, for example, either for validating what comes out of it or for sort of just enriching it in general. You can see, for example, business versus family and leisure. Business, almost all just one single traveler involved in a booking. Family and leisure, in a lot of different cases, you have 3, 4, or even more than 4. That sounds like a family booking a vacation, right?
Yeah. One thing I do actually have a question here. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
So you brought up a good point. We just use kind of the survey data for model kind of testing, making sure it made sense.
Yeah.
What if we didn't have that data? What are some techniques you could use to kind of, I know you said, 1 to 2 travelers, but is it using historical data or forward-looking data? Can you?
Yeah, great question. So you would probably have to get a little bit creative. A survey is probably the highest quality I could think of data to help us determine that, right? Okay. You could probably use third-party data, right? Mm-hmm. If you could find a third-party data set that had whatever indicator, whatever variable you were looking for to try to distinguish between groups, right? Okay. You can associate that, and this is getting really more to your wheelhouse, but you can associate that third party with your sort of first party data, right?
Right. I gotcha.
Or like you mentioned, the multiple travelers thing, you'd have to go into your own database and find variables or behaviors that would be strongly correlated with said behavior.
Okay. Okay, that's good to know. Just because like not every of our audience development use case will have that. So.
No, it won't. But
Yeah.
that was very lucky in this case. It is.
Yes.
But it's also validating, right? Have business travelers that over-index on the survey. And I guess one more note to make, kind of off the cuff here, is we see this every single time we run this audience modeling process. If we have some way of validating it against some sort of known entity, the systems in place find audiences that very cleanly map onto either business objectives or known survey results or something like that. It's kind of fascinating.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Thanks. All right. So for this approach, right, we have, all the clusters we're kind of going after the audiences, right? This client really wanted to test this, right? So what I want to walk you through now is kind of the data activation approach. And what I mean by data activation approach is taking those clusters that were created, right? And then either onboarding them in the media space, the site side space, or even with like email and CRM, right? So the nice thing about this is we're pretty flexible with what we collect in Tapestry. We have third-party and first-party identifiers that allow for really straightforward activation. So I'm just going to start off with an example here of some IDs we collect in Tapestry are one like a DMP ID, an actual customer level identifier, as well as a first-party personalization ID, we'll call it for this use case, which is basically a cookie ID, right? These all get fed into Tapestry. And what you could do is you could layer on the clusters that Brad's team developed, right? And tie it to what identifier you need. Now, of course, there is some identity stitching that goes into it and some rules around it, but it's pretty straightforward to go in and send these clusters to, let's say, a DMP, or let's say you want to email to these users, you could use a CRM system, right? Or even an on-site personalization tool, you could use that first-party cookie ID to onboard. And then what's really valuable too is if you have the actual customer record, right, you can most likely tie it back to an email address. And that's very powerful in the advertising world now. So we have a lot of flexibility there on how we onboard this. And of course, to see if these clusters are working right, you want to go and activate on it, right? Yep. So for this client, we really leverage these clusters for arriving on the website. So for instance, let's say you get dropped onto the homepage. We know you're a business travel, for instance, we want to tailor the message for you, right? Or let's say you're not a business traveler, right? We want to take you to some other area of the website. So for this use case, what we did, I'll start off with the clusters, right? This client used Adobe Audience Manager. And what we were able to do is bring in those actual IDs into Audience Manager and create a profile merge rule with those and actually have them be part of the DMP. Once they're in a DMP, it's very easy to go out and onboard them to, let's say, a advertising partner or just to your site, right? So this client used Adobe Target for their on-site personalization and A/B testing tool. And the really nice thing with this integration is segments can be shared between Adobe Audience Manager and Adobe Target. So what we did is we basically created these segments, clusters, what I was referring to earlier, that we were looking at before, and we had all 5 of these basically in the DMP, for instance, and we could change the messaging based on that and go in and actually measure them. So when you arrive on the website, right, you were getting a tailored message between what audience you kind of fell in. And that's really the value of doing this, to test and learn into this. So yeah, this was a really neat use case for our data activation practice.
Yeah, the whole thing, since it's end-to-end dealing with individuals, right, from the data source all the way into the DMP and target on the other end, it's actually really easy to do this, right?
Yes. Now there's always nuances, right?
Right.
But yes, it makes it easy to kind of onboard this data.
And we've I'm gonna put you on the hot seat. So we've done this in AEP, LinkedIn, DMP and Target here, and I think some media.
Yes, we've done it with Facebook too for clients.
Yeah,
where we actually push the customer IDs into Facebook.
Yeah.
As well, we've done it with Google Customer Match as well.
and a display partner that I remember, and also CRM too. So we've done this across a bunch of different channels. So I'm trying to drive.
Yes, exactly.
Are there any compare and contrast between our experiences with any of those? Are any of them easy or difficult? Or
I would say, I mean, the most straightforward is going to be onboarding like hash customer IDs. I mean, it's good. You're going to get the best match rates, right? I would say when the data is not properly stitched right, or you have a lot of data quality issues, is where we run into a lot of issues with onboarding them. LinkedIn is sometimes a pain with that. I've seen just, you know, we've worked on a project before with LinkedIn on the audience match rates, but no, for the most part, if your data is categorized, clean and stitched, right?
pretty
So,
cool. Yeah.
So cool. I think we're about to wrap up here. So yeah, I know you had a lot of like future opportunities for this that you're working with your clients. Do you kind of want to go through them?
Yeah, sure. Number one, I think, is customer journey orchestration, right? Because you can do this through multiple channels. And again, since all of this is being done at the individual level, you know, when somebody, you know, takes a certain action, right? So you can coordinate messaging through email plus, you know, paid social, display, any medium that you have access to, you can kind of mediate how much or how little messaging an individual gets based on their profile. And we are currently developing internally a product called Audience Match. Everything that you just saw, our entire process is always based on historical data, what somebody has been doing for the last year or 2 or 6 months. It depends mostly on the sales cycle. What happens if somebody new visits your website, right? They are not going to be immediately bucketed into one of these persona groups. So what Audience Match does is one of 2 things. It buckets brand new individuals into personas based on whatever their behavior is on site. And the second thing that it does is continually updates your current customer base, right? We saw dormant travelers, non-travelers earlier. Well, some of those folks are probably going to start feeling more comfortable about traveling in the coming years or months, right? So eventually they'll come back, and once they do, are they a business traveler? Are they a family and leisure traveler? You don't want to just miss out on that audience. So Audience Match basically keeps your personas up to date as time goes on. One last thing I wanted to conclude on, Jeff, is like, could it work for you, right? Anybody watching right now, is there any case that you can see where this wouldn't be applicable, right?
I mean, going through no, I mean, I think any website we work with, this is probably applicable. Now, depending on what data you have and don't have is definitely key, right? But no, I'm thinking off the top of my head, like we work with a client that's into big fan engagement, right? Trying to monetize fans. This could be an amazing case for that, for audience modeling. So no, I think everyone could find opportunities for this approach.
Yeah, we've done this now across B2B, B2C, manufacturing, sports and entertainment, travel, and hospitality. At least 2 clients in travel and hospitality, actually. So vertical, B2B, B2C. We have a proposal out for this in B2B, B2C. It doesn't really matter. I think it'll work.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I agree.
All right.
Well, cool. I think that wraps us up. We did want to save time for a few questions. Sammy, were there any questions in the chat?
I don't see any in the chat right now, but if anyone has one and wants to raise your hand or throw it in, we've got some time.
I think we'll take that as a no.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll just say I appreciate everyone joining. This was a really fun use case to present to you guys.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful day, and please reach out if you have any questions.